Started my own business at 19, paid off my debts, and bought a house in cash. Then my family sued me for taking the life my sister deserved. The process server had a nice smile. I remember that more clearly than I remember what he said, because for about 4 seconds, I thought he was a neighbor stopping by to complain about my truck blocking the mailbox. Emily Voss, that's me, you've been served. He held the manila envelope out the way you'd hand someone a flyer for a car wash. I actually reached for it before my brain caught up with my hands. Behind him, my front walk was still wet from the sprinklers I'd installed 2 weekends earlier. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I hoped the water hadn't gotten on the papers. Then I opened it standing right there on my own front porch, in the house I had bought outright 11 months earlier, the paint on the railing still smelling faintly new, and read that my parents and my sister were suing me for $180,000. Or in the alternative, the house itself. Cause of action, unjust enrichment. Plaintiffs, Gerald and Linda Voss, Madison Voss, defendant, me. Their theory, laid out in careful, deliberate lawyer language, was that I had appropriated resources, opportunities, and a trajectory rightfully belonging to my sister. In plain English, they were suing me for the crime of being the one who actually did the work. I stood on my porch and read it twice. Then I got in my car, still holding it, and drove to the house I grew up in, because some stupid, loyal part of me still believed a conversation could fix this. I'd been running my own cleaning company for 4 years by then. Voss Residential Services. 14 employees, 3 vans, a client list that took me 2 years of 80-hour weeks to build one referral at a time. I started it at 19 with nothing but a mop bucket, a rented Honda Civic, and $800 I'd saved scrubbing other people's ovens. By 23, I'd paid off every debt I owned. My car, my equipment loans, a stretch of credit card debt from the year I couldn't make payroll and covered it myself, and closed on a 3-bedroom house in full, cash, no mortgage. I still remember the number on the cashier's check, $211,000. I'd never seen that many zeros belong to me before. Madison, my sister, is 2 years older than me. She'd had the room with the better closet, the car at 16, the unpaid internship our dad arranged through a client of his. She'd had, by every measure our parents ever used, the better start. I didn't resent her for it back then. I just noticed it, the way you notice weather. What I noticed more, looking back, were the small red flags I'd talked myself out of for years. The way Dad introduced my business to people as Emily's little cleaning thing, like it was a paper route. The way Mom would mention Madison's stalled wedding planning right after I mentioned closing on the house, like the two things were in competition. The way nobody in my family had ever once asked me how I'd actually done it. Not the mechanics, not the years, just the ending, and whether it was fair that I'd gotten there first. There was a dinner, maybe 8 months before the papers, where I made the mistake of mentioning I'd hit 6 figures in revenue for the year. I hadn't meant it as a brag. It just came up, the way work comes up at dinners. Madison put her fork down and said quietly that some people had to work for things and some people just had things handed to them. And wasn't it interesting how I'd ended up in the second category despite starting with nothing? I laughed, because I thought she was joking. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. Dad changed the subject to the weather like nothing had happened at all. And I remember thinking at the time that the silence afterward felt less like awkwardness and more like agreement. I told myself it was nothing. Families compare. It didn't mean anything. I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't understand how wrong for another 8 months. My parents' kitchen smelled like the same lemon cleaner it always had. Madison was already sitting at the table when I walked in, arms crossed, chin up, dressed like she was headed somewhere important afterward. Mom stood at the counter and wouldn't look at me. Dad slid the lawsuit across the table toward me like it was an invoice I'd forgotten to pay. You always had to win, he said. I cleaned toilets at midnight while she slept until noon, I said. How is that stealing? Madison shot up out of her chair. Because you knew I couldn't compete with you. I didn't know you were competing at all, I said. I thought you were just living your life. Mom gasped like I'd slapped her. How dare you talk to your sister like that? Dad leaned across the table, close enough that I could smell his coffee. Settle quietly, Emily, or we ruin you in court. Every client, every review, gone. I almost laughed. Almost. You'd really do that, I said. To your own daughter. You stopped being ours the day you got ahead, he said. Madison's smile came back, thin and satisfied, like she'd already won something. I looked at her and realized I didn't recognize the expression on her face. I'd seen my sister annoyed with me 100 times. I had never seen her look at me like I was a problem to be solved. I didn't say anything else. I got in my car and sat in the driveway of the house I grew up in for 11 minutes before I could make my hands steady enough to drive. I remember staring at the garage door, the same one Dad had repainted the summer I turned 15, and thinking that I couldn't point to a single moment when this had started, only that it clearly had, long before today, and I'd simply been too busy working to notice. That night, I called Rachel Kim. Rachel had handled my business's contracts for 3 years. Vendor agreements, a lease dispute with a strip mall landlord, the paperwork when I converted from a sole proprietorship to an LLC. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear a TV muted in the background. They want to paint you as the villain, she said, after I read her the complaint line by line. So, we show whoever's in that room who actually wrote that story. Bring me everything. Every bank statement, every text, every piece of paper with your name on it, going back to when this started feeling wrong. Even if you think it doesn't matter, especially then. How long do we have? Mediation gets ordered fast in family financial disputes. Courts like to push these out of the courtroom if there's any chance of settlement. I'd guess 2-3 weeks before we're sitting across a table from them. That's not much time. So we start tonight. I want to say I built that file because I'm disciplined. The truth is I built it because running a company with 14 people on payroll teaches you to keep paperwork the way other people keep grudges. Every invoice, every 1099, every signed client agreement, because one bad review or one unpaid bill could sink me. And I'd learned that the hard way once already. I didn't know when I started saving those records 4 years earlier that the habit would end up being the thing that saved me from my own family, but it did. For 2 days, I sat at my kitchen table with Rachel on speakerphone and built the file. Bank statements going back 6 years. Text messages I'd screenshotted out of habit more than instinct. And the rent agreement, the one Dad had made me sign at 17 in his handwriting, requiring $650 a month for 2 years while I was still in high school, while Madison, 19 and unemployed, paid nothing and drove a car he'd bought her outright. I found a message from Mom, sent 2 years earlier, calling my house Madison's dream, stolen by Emily. I found another from Dad, describing my company as just made work to a cousin who'd forwarded it to me back then out of pity I hadn't wanted at the time. Rachel added one more thing to the file on the second night, a voicemail. Dad had left it on my phone the week before the lawsuit was filed, and I'd never listened past the first 6 seconds because I assumed it was another lecture about visiting more. Listen to the whole thing, Rachel said, before you decide how much mercy they deserve. I listened to it 4 times. Sitting alone in my kitchen. Each time, my hands shook a little less. I tried one more thing before it went any further. I called Mom alone, no lawyers, no Dad on the line, and asked her, almost begging, to just talk to me like a person instead of a plaintiff. Mom, please, this is insane. You know I earned every bit of this. There was a long pause. Then, your father knows what's right for this family, Emily. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. She hung up first. I sat there holding a dead phone for a while, and that was the moment I stopped hoping this would resolve itself around a kitchen table. Some fights only end in rooms with a court reporter in the corner. Rachel wasn't surprised when I told her. Extended families that sue each other rarely have one villain and one victim having a bad week, she said. Usually it's a pattern that finally got a legal name attached to it. Now, I got the demand letter from their attorney this morning. His name's Gary Holcomb. He attends their church. I want you braced for it because it's aggressive. The letter, when she read it to me, claimed I had been unjustly enriched by resources that should have gone to Madison. The internship contact, the rent money, even, absurdly, an inheritance from our grandmother, that Holcomb's letter implied I had maneuvered toward myself. It demanded the $180,000 or the house within 30 days, or they'd proceed to trial and, in Holcomb's words, let a jury decide who this family's success actually belongs to. They're trying to scare you into paying before anyone with a law degree looks closely at the actual money, Rachel said. Unjust enrichment requires that you got something for nothing, at someone else's expense, and it'd be unfair for you to keep it. I don't lose sleep over demand letters, Emily. I lose sleep over clients who fold before they see what the other side actually has, which, in this case, is nothing. But we're going to prove that with numbers, not adjectives. That was how Daniel Osei entered the file. Daniel was a CPA and forensic accountant Rachel had used in 2 prior cases, a decade spent untangling small business fraud claims for local courts, the kind of person who spoke in numbers the way other people speak in feelings. Rachel sent him 6 years of my bank statements, my LLC formation documents, my tax returns, and the demand letter's inheritance claim. He called 4 days later. Your grandmother's estate was $17,000, split 3 ways per the will, probated in county court 8 years ago, he said. You received your third. Madison received hers. There is no maneuvering here. There's a public probate record with your name on it for exactly what you were owed and not $1 more. And the rent money? That's the interesting part. I could hear him flipping through something. $650 a month for 24 months. Starting the month you turned 17. $15,600 total, paid directly to your father's checking account. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates against Madison's private school tuition invoices for the same period, which your parents also produced in discovery, thinking it helped their case. My stomach dropped before he even finished the sentence. They match, he said. Almost to the dollar, almost to the month. The money you paid your father as rent at 17 funded your sister's tuition. Not yours, hers. I sat with that, almost to the dollar, almost to the month. The money you paid your father as rent at 17 funded your sister's tuition. Not yours, yours. Hers. I sat with that for a long moment. I'd known the rent was unfair. I hadn't known where it went. How did you even find the tuition invoices? Your parents produced them themselves, Daniel said, and I could hear something close to satisfaction in his voice. Their attorney included Madison's private school records in the initial disclosure, trying to establish how much the family had invested in her over the years to support the damages figure. He handed me the second half of the equation without realizing it. That happens more often than you'd think in cases like this. People build a story around the parts of the record they remember. They forget the rest of it is sitting in the same file. I want that in writing, I said. It already is, Daniel said. It's Exhibit 14. The professional threat came 6 days before mediation, and it was the loop that scared me most, because it wasn't aimed at my family anymore. It was aimed at the 14 people who depended on my company for a paycheck. One of my longtime clients, a property manager named Louise Fenwick who'd used Voss Residential Services for 3 years across 4 buildings, called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice careful in a way I didn't like. Emily, I got a call from a man claiming to be your father. He told me you were, and I'm quoting him, under investigation for financial fraud, and that I should consider other vendors before it became a liability for me. My hands went cold before my brain caught up, the same way they had on the porch 3 weeks earlier. Louise, I promise you that's not true. There's a family dispute. There's no fraud investigation, no charges, nothing. I believed you before you said a word, she said. I just wanted you to know he called. And Emily, I kept the voicemail he left in case it's useful. It was useful. But it wasn't the only call. 2 days later, a smaller client, a dentist's office I'd cleaned every week for a year and a half, emailed to say they'd heard some concerning things and were pausing service pending clarity. I called the office manager directly, my stomach in knots the whole time, and talked her through the actual situation for 15 minutes before she agreed to keep the contract. It cost me an afternoon and most of my composure. It cost my father nothing, as far as he knew, which was exactly the problem. Rachel filed both voicemails the same week as supplemental exhibits and sent Holcomb a letter reminding him that contacting a business's clients with false claims of criminal fraud in the middle of active litigation could expose his clients to a separate claim for tortious interference and defamation, on top of whatever a jury made of the original lawsuit. Dad's response, relayed through Holcomb 2 days later, was that he'd been expressing concern as a father and that no further calls would be made. Rachel read it to me flatly. That's not an apology. That's a man realizing the ground under him just got smaller. I thought about the message from years ago calling my business Just Made Work. I thought about how easily he'd tried to burn down the thing he called small the moment it actually threatened him back. 2 days before mediation, Rachel had me meet Marcus Feldman, a licensed digital forensics examiner she used whenever authenticity of a recording or a text thread might get challenged in front of a judge or mediator. Holcomb's the type to argue a voicemail was edited or taken out of context, Rachel said. I want Marcus to establish chain of custody on the one your father left you, so nobody in that room gets to pretend it's not exactly what it sounds like. Marcus pulled the file directly from my phone's backup, documented the original timestamp against my carrier's server logs, and produced a report confirming the recording was unaltered and had been created 6 days before the lawsuit was filed, which mattered more than I understood until Rachel explained it to me that night. If he made that threat before he ever filed, she said, it isn't just an ugly thing your father said in a moment of anger after being sued. It's evidence he intended to extort you into a settlement before the ink on the complaint was even dry. That's not a family being petty. Depending on what's actually on that recording, that's a crime. I hadn't let myself think the word extortion yet. Hearing Rachel say it out loud made the whole thing feel colder and more real than the lawsuit itself ever had. The mediator was set. Diane Whitfield, a retired family court commissioner who now worked as an accredited mediator, specializing in exactly this kind of pre-trial family financial dispute. Rachel had appeared in front of her twice before. She doesn't perform sympathy for anyone, Rachel said. She just watches who's telling the truth and who's performing being wronged. In my experience, those two things look very different up close. Mediation was set for the following Monday, downtown 9th floor, a conference room with a long table and a view of nothing in particular. Diane Whitfield was already seated at the head of the table when Rachel and I walked in, reviewing a folder with the unhurried focus of someone who had sat through several hundred rooms exactly like this one during her years on the family court bench. Rachel had warned me she didn't raise her voice, didn't need to, and that the stillest person in the room was usually the one actually running it. I understood what she meant within the first minute. My parents arrived with Gary Holcomb, a heavyset man in a gray suit who greeted Diane with the easy familiarity of someone who'd built half his career on his church directory. Madison wore cream, like she was the one who'd been wronged. She caught my eye across the table and mouthed the word sorry, without meaning a single letter of it. Diane opened plainly. This is a voluntary process. Nobody in this room is required to reach an agreement today, but I'd encourage everyone to remember that whatever isn't resolved here gets resolved in front of a jury, with a great deal less privacy than this room offers, and considerably less control over how the story gets told. Holcomb went first, smooth as a man reading from a script he'd delivered before. This family wants healing, not war. My clients are prepared to be reasonable if Ms. Voss is prepared to acknowledge the imbalance she created. Rachel didn't blink. Then your clients should stop committing extortion. Dad's face went tight. Watch your mouth. I paid rent at 17, I said, sliding the agreement across the table, along with Daniel's report. $650 a month. There's the receipts. And there's where the money actually went, straight into Madison's tuition, the same months, almost to the dollar. So let's talk about who invested in who. Mom's voice cracked. That was different. We were teaching you real responsibility. You were billing your 17-year-old daughter, I said, and funding your other daughter with the proceeds, and telling people you were supporting me. Madison rolled her eyes, though I noticed her hands had gone still on the table in a way they hadn't been a minute earlier. This doesn't erase anything. You used us. Dad got you your first client, your fiancé's boss, I said. Robert Chen, after you spilled wine on his carpet at your internship dinner. He paid me $80 to come clean it up at 11 at night. That's not a gift, Madison. That's a job I did while you were asleep. Dad slammed his hand flat on the table. Enough. No, I said. Not enough. Not yet. Daniel O.C., sitting beside Rachel, opened a folder and slid it toward Diane Whitfield. For the record, Ms. Whitfield, I've reviewed 6 years of Ms. Voss's business financials, her tax filings, and the probate record for the estate referenced in the complaint. There is no unaccounted inheritance, no diverted family resource beyond the tuition transfer I've just described, and no basis in the documentation for the damages figure claimed. Holcomb's jaw tightened. The first crack I'd seen in him. He hadn't known about the tuition match. I could tell from the half-second it took him to recover. Madison's composure went next. You're enjoying this, she said, and her voice had lost its polish. A little? I said. You sued me for surviving on 80-hour weeks while you slept until noon. Forgive me for defending it. I need this money, Emily. It came out of her fast, too fast, like it had been sitting behind her teeth the whole meeting. The wedding, the deposit on the venue. We're behind on everything. And you have a house and I have nothing, and nobody in this family will just say that out loud except me. The room went quiet enough that I heard the air conditioning cycle on. It was the first honest thing my sister had said in 3 weeks, and it had come out looking like a confession because it was one. Then you should have asked me, I said, quieter than anything else I'd said all morning. Not sued me, asked me. Madison didn't answer that. She looked down at her hands instead, and for the first time since the process server had knocked on my door, she didn't look like someone who thought she'd already won. Holcomb straightened his jacket, visibly trying to steer the room back onto solid ground. My clients are prepared to discuss dismissal, provided— Before you finish that sentence, Rachel said, there's something Ms. Whitfield should hear. She set a small recorder on the table. Marcus Feldman's authentication report sat beside it, already copied for everyone in the room. Madison frowned. What is that? Dad's eyes moved from the recorder to me, and something behind them shifted for the first time all meeting. Not anger anymore, but the particular stillness of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. This recording was left on my client's phone 6 days before this lawsuit was filed, Rachel said, looking directly at my father. It has been authenticated by a licensed digital forensics examiner whose report is in front of you. Mr. Voss, would you like to characterize what's on it for Ms. Whitfield, or should we simply play it? Nobody answered. Rachel's thumb hovered over the button, and I watched my father's face do something I'd never seen it do in 23 years. Go completely, wordlessly afraid. She pressed play. His own voice filled the room, flatter and colder than I remembered it sounding in person. You settle quietly, or I make calls. Every client you have finds out you can't be trusted. Every review gets buried under new ones I'll make sure get written. You'll lose that house within a year, and you'll deserve it for thinking you got there on your own. The recording ran 20 more seconds. Nobody in that room moved until it finished. Mom's hand had gone to her mouth somewhere around the second sentence and stayed there. Madison was staring at a spot on the table like she was trying to disappear into it. I realized I'd been holding my own breath since Rachel pressed play, and I let it out slowly, careful not to let it sound like triumph because it wasn't. It was just relief, the kind that comes after you've been braced for something for so long that its arrival almost knocks you over. Holcomb was the first to speak, and his voice had lost every ounce of its earlier smoothness. Gerald, I need 5 minutes alone with my clients. Now. Take 10. Gerald, I need 5 minutes alone with my clients. Now. Take 10. Diane Whitfield said, not looking up from the notes she was making. I'll want to discuss what I've just heard on the record before this session continues. They came back into the room 20 minutes later, and the difference was immediate. Holcomb did the talking now, and he did it fast, the practiced calm of a man trying to close a door before more of the house burned. My clients are prepared to dismiss the complaint with prejudice, effective today, in exchange for a mutual release and a confidentiality provision regarding today's proceedings. No confidentiality provision, Rachel said. My client isn't the one who has anything to hide. Diane Whitfield set down her pen. For what it's worth, given what was just played in this room, I'd advise your clients that a confidentiality clause offered after a recorded threat of extortion tends to look to any future court court exactly like what it is. I'd take the dismissal and leave quietly, Mr. Holcomb. He took the dismissal. I signed the release an hour later in a smaller room down the hall, just Rachel and me and a notary. Dismissed with prejudice, which meant they could never bring the same claim against me again. No settlement paid, no house handed over, just the file. Finally closed, the way I'd built it to be closed from the first night I called Rachel. The consequences moved slower than the lawsuit had, but they moved. Gary Holcomb stopped attending the church he'd shared with my parents within 2 months, according to a cousin who still went. I never learned exactly what was said in whatever room church elders discussed things like that in, and I didn't ask. What I did hear, secondhand and more than once, was that the story of a lawyer bringing a recorded extortion threat into a mediation on behalf of his own congregation members had traveled through that community faster than any sermon ever had. Dad's small independent insurance office, the one he'd run for 18 years on a foundation of community trust and referrals from that same congregation, lost enough of its client base over the following year that he eventually merged it into a larger agency just to keep the doors open. Nobody sued him for the false fraud claim he'd made to Louise Fenwick, or the one made to the dentist's office. I didn't push it. I didn't need to. The story simply traveled the way small-town stories do, accurately, from person to person who'd once trusted him. One of my crew leads, a woman named Priya, who'd been with me almost since the beginning, asked me a few weeks after the dismissal whether the company was actually in trouble because she'd heard something about a lawsuit from a client's building manager. I told her the truth, that it had been a family matter, resolved, and that the company had never once been at risk. She nodded, relieved, and went back to loading a van. I remember standing there afterward thinking about how strange it was that my father's threats had traveled further and faster among strangers than they ever had inside our own family, where apparently nobody had believed I was worth defending until a recorder was involved. Madison's engagement didn't survive the year, though I don't think the lawsuit alone broke it. Robert Chen, her fiancé's boss, and my very first client, had been in the room's orbit long enough to hear the wine carpet story land differently than Madison had probably ever told it to him. I heard secondhand that it wasn't the deciding factor in whatever happened between her and her fiancé, but it wasn't nothing either. Mom called me once, 8 months later, and didn't apologize so much as ask, quietly, if I'd consider starting over as a family. I told her I'd consider it when somebody in that family could say out loud what they'd actually done, instead of asking me to pretend it hadn't happened. She hasn't called again. I think about that less than I expected to. My business kept growing. Voss Residential Services has 19 employees now. 2 new contracts with property management companies I picked up the year after the lawsuit, including, quietly, 1 more building from Louise Fenwick, who never once brought up the phone call again except to say she was glad it turned out to be nothing. I still have the folder. Rent agreement, bank statements, Daniel's report, Marcus's authentication, the transcript of the recording, all of it filed the same meticulous way I file every invoice and every client contract, because that's simply how I keep things now. It sits in the same cabinet as 6 years of tax returns and every signed agreement I've ever collected, which is, I think, the truest thing anyone could say about how I got here in the first place. I don't look at the folder often. I don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, least of all myself. I didn't destroy my father that day in that conference room. I want to be honest about that, because it would make a better story if I had, and this isn't that kind of story. I just stopped protecting him from the truth of what he'd said out loud, 6 days before he decided I was worth suing. The truth did the rest. It always does, if you just let it play all the way through, and you have the patience to keep every receipt until it can.